Thank you everyone for joining. We'll just take a couple of minutes while we allow more people to join. If you will be needing interpretation services today, please click the interpretation icon at the bottom of your tool screen. It should look like a globe. Buenas tardes a todos. Bienvenidos. Vamos a dar unos minutos mientras llegan más participantes. Si van a necesitar servicios de interpretación, en la parte de abajo de su pantalla pueden ver un icono de interpretación que se mira como un mundo. Si presionan ahí, pueden comenzar la interpretación.
Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Buenas tardes to everyone. My name is Adrián Pedrosa. I am the Executive Director of Abriendo Puertas, Opening Doors. Feliz Año Nuevo. And on behalf of our organization and our partners at UnidosUS, we thank you for being with us here today for this presentation on our report, Latino Family Voices, Creating a Better Future for Our Children. This report reflects a year of listening that we've engaged in this past year that includes focus groups, personal storytelling, interviews, and a national survey sample of Latino families that Dr. Gabe Sanchez will present today. Many of you here today, from parents and caregivers to family serving organizations, contributed to this report, and we're grateful to you for your contributions. With the Latino population at over 62 million in the US, nearly 1 in 5 people, over the last decade, more than half, 51% of the US population growth came from Latinos. This to say that we believe it is essential to understand and invest in the opportunities and strengths of Latino families. What we will present today in a brief 1 hour is a compelling narrative of whole family needs or the economic and social issues as experienced by Latino families. And our focus is on families with children birth to 5, including expectant families. We also focus a significant sample on families prenatal to 3, recognizing that this is a critical stage of development during these first 3 years of a child's life. This report will set the stage for our collective ongoing work that we and many of you are committed to doing. And that is to ensure that at the core of our work are the voices, leadership, and partnership of families to move forward solutions for whole family well-being. Next slide. This year, with the support of our funding partners at the Pritzker Family Foundation, UnidosUS and Abriendo Puertas will also be launching the Latino Infant Initiative, a national network that will work with families and our partners to center family needs and solutions in the prenatal to 3-year space. We thank many of you, including our advisory group, who will guide, shape, and move this work forward with us. Again, we thank each of you for the work that you do every day on the ground as nonprofit organizations, educators, philanthropy, faith-based organizations, and of course, the parents and caregivers. Thank you for ensuring and working toward the well-being of our families and children. To go ahead and kick us off and to get us started and centered in this discussion, we've asked Melanie Cardenas to get us started. Melanie is among the many parents and caregivers who have shaped and contributed to this report with their input and sharing of their experiences during focus groups, interviews, and conversations. She was introduced to us through our wonderful partners at Avance Inc., an UnidosUS affiliate. She's a mother of 3, and her insights have been invaluable to our learnings. So we thank you, Melanie, for being with us here today. We're honored that you've agreed to contribute part of your story to this report. So Melanie, we've gotten to know you a little bit through this process. Can you just speak a little bit about who you are with the participants?
Yes, thank you. I'm happy to be here as well, sharing my story and a little background about myself. I grew up on the west side of San Antonio. I'm the youngest of 4 girls, And my mother worked really hard to send us all to Catholic school, and we are all first-generation college graduates. My husband, Jesse, he works as an industrial electrician, and I'm currently employed as a substitute teacher. Like you said, I have 3 children, David and Dylan. They're both honor roll students, Cub Scouts, good boys. And I have a 3-year-old daughter named Jordan. And we're blessed to currently have her attending an early learning center where she's learning a lot and getting prepared to start school next year. The past year has been difficult for my family. As you've touched on some of the statistics you're going to discuss, my family was one of the families terminated from food stamps. So definitely providing food for my family has been a struggle. There's also some concerns that I might lose my medical insurance once the national health emergency is declared to be over. So that's something in the back of my mind that I'm concerned about. There's also the challenge of becoming a homeowner is really great. And one of the things that is, I feel like preventing me or in the way of that are my student loans. So I know there's a lot of talk right now in the news about student loan forgiveness, and that's something that would really help me if that program, the student loan forgiveness for the public loans, if you've worked in education. So I'm hoping something like that would go through, because that would definitely help me with my debt and help me work on becoming a homeowner, because that would be our ultimate goal for me and my family. Something else that the government could do to help me would be to help with the childcare expenses. The daycare is at least $200 a week, and it's something that we struggle with, on a weekly basis. And anytime something happens, like a car repair or somebody's sick, we have to miss work, it really affects my family a lot. We've had to get title loans on cars. We've had to go to the pawn shop, borrowing money, and it's really difficult. So I'm definitely happy to be here to tell my story and share any ways that I think might be helpful to people like me in my situation.
Very good, Melanie. Thank you so much. One for just being open and willing to share your story. Some of the things you described as Dr. Gabe Sanchez gets into the data, are things that we continuously hear, not just from families like in your local community and such as the story you shared, but across the country. So we hope that by being able to listen deeply, directly from families about where your struggles and challenges are, and most importantly, where your hopes, dreams and aspirations are for you and your children, that we can come together to put forth solutions. So we appreciate you just being a part of this, and look forward to that continued work with you. Thank you, Melanie. Now, I'd like to go ahead and kick it off to Dr. Gabriel Sanchez. He's the Vice President of Research at BSP Research. BSP Research has been an ongoing partner of ours in this work with us in UnidosUS to put together this report. And we are really grateful for their work, really doing that deep listening across the country with a representative sample of Latino families across the country. So Dr. Gabe Sanchez, I'll kick it to you.
Thank you, Mr. Pedraza. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to be part of this webinar, to share the survey data. And I love the partnership between Abriendo Puertas, ourselves at BSP Research, and UnidosUS, primarily because unlike a lot of projects where I'm the lead researcher and focus a lot on quantitative data, usually from surveys like this, what I love about this partnership is merging that quantitative data that I'll share with you with direct stories from families and parents and primary caregivers, just like you heard from Melanie. And so I'll try to give Melanie her due justice by connecting some of what we've seen from the wider sample of parents across the country and her own experiences and the experiences of her family. Thank you very much, Melanie, for sharing those. I think it provides a lot of context for the data that I'll share with you. So a little bit about the survey specifications before I get into breaking down the data for you. You see that we had a very large sample of Latino parents and primary caregivers, just over 1,300 total respondents. And the key that I want to emphasize is I've been polling parents of young kids 0 to 5 with an oversample in this context of kids 0 to 3 years of age for quite some time, over a decade. This is the first survey I've ever seen that has a dedicated sample of expecting families. across the country, specifically of Latino expected families. So you'll see I'll provide some examples of why having that unique nuance to this survey is important, because in many cases, unfortunately, expecting families among the Latino community are facing greater challenges than the wider overall population of Latino families across the United States. At BSP Research, we always like to collect our data through as broad and diverse range of methodology as possible. So in this survey, for example, we used a combination of web-based and telephone interviews. And on the telephone side, we have the ability to reach people on both landlines and cell phones, either in English or Spanish. We have fully bilingual interviewers on our team, so individuals can move back and forth between English and Spanish if they like, and decide up front which language they want to take the survey in. You see overall margin of error is very small at 2.7% for the overall sample, with slightly higher margin of errors for some of the subsamples, including oversamples we had for the state of New Mexico and Los Angeles County. First theme that I want to share with you is unfortunately pretty sobering data that emphasizes that Latino families unfortunately continue to face many economic challenges. And we know that Latino families are more likely to face many of these economic challenges than families of other racial and ethnic groups across the country. One of the many indicators in the survey that intended to provide an opportunity to analyze the financial well-being of Latino families is to basically ask them how concerned they are about a wide range of issues. You see, unfortunately, almost 40% of Latino families with young children across the country are extremely concerned that they will not be able to provide a good future for their children. Just think about how difficult that is for many parents and primary caregivers that have to face the reality of, unfortunately, not looking into the future and believing that they will be able to provide their children with a better future than they themselves had. Overemphasizing the struggles that many of our folks are facing across the country, nearly a third, at 31% of the full sample, are extremely concerned that they will not have enough food to eat every day. Just think about that for a moment in terms of food insecurity. If nearly a third of Latino families with children aged 5 years and under literally are extremely concerned, not just concerned, but extremely concerned, they will not have enough food for themselves and their children to eat every day. Pretty, again, sobering data. Finally, more than 1/3 are extremely concerned that they will not be able to afford childcare. This is very similar to what Melanie opened with in terms of her own family situation. I want to emphasize that unfortunately, this notion of being able to afford to pay for childcare directly impacts many families' ability to look for full-time employment, better paying employment, maybe going back to school or training themselves to better not only their economic well-being, but for their future generations, simply because they have to make the very difficult decision of taking those economic opportunities or being able to afford childcare. Again, emphasizing what you heard from Melanie at the opening of our presentation. Among other challenges that Latino families across the country are being faced with, I emphasize this point as one of the longer-term implications from the economic challenges Latino parents are facing right now. You see 1 in 10 or 10% of the full sample of Latino parents indicated to us that they postponed or quit their education because of the rising cost of living. So think about that for a moment, right? Postponing or formally quitting education that we know will lead to higher paying jobs for their families is unfortunately directly impacting not only the parents themselves, but unfortunately the children's economic well-being for a generation, if not more to come. So we know, unfortunately, many of these difficult decisions Latino families are facing have long-term implications for their families. Among other economic challenges in the past year, you see that nearly 40% of respondents have had to borrow money from friends or family to manage their financial situation, specifically in the past year. And in line with what you heard from Melanie at the opening, unfortunately, almost 20% or 1 in 5 of Latino parents and primary caregivers have had to turn to payday loans, which we know have exorbitantly high interest rates to be able to weather the financial storm that they're in right now. 1/3 of the sample has had to use up all or most of their savings already. And we know economic times, unfortunately, are projected to be just as rough in the following year. So this is a very dangerous statistic to see that so many of our folks have already used up whatever safety net they had available for themselves and their families. And nearly 1/3 at 30% have had to postpone their children's activities, again, detrimentally impacting their children's overall well-being, not just now, but projected into the future. When we isolate this series of questions asking about managing financial situations due to specifically the increase in the cost of living, so inflation we know directly impacting Latinos more than Americans of any other racial and ethnic group across the country, we see that unfortunately our youngest Latino families, those that are expecting families, unfortunately are facing some of these challenges to a greater extent than the overall sample of Latino families nationwide. This includes expected families being 7% more likely to indicate that they've had to postpone or cut back on their family or children's activities. And you see significantly more likely to have postponed or cut back on health-related expenses. So unfortunately, again, our youngest families, those that are expecting children on the way, are unfortunately facing even greater economic challenges than Latino families overall. I'll also add, for some of you that did not see our earlier webinar about a month ago that emphasized specifically the challenges with long COVID that many of our Latino families are facing across the country, those families with long-term effects of COVID are also more likely to face many of these economic challenges than Latino families overall. You heard from Melanie that unfortunately their family has had difficulty being able to access public benefits. And unfortunately, that's the reality for far too many Latino families across the country. In fact, as you see in front of you, approximately 1 in 4 or 25% of parents do not have insurance for themselves or their children at the time of the interview. And unfortunately, nearly half of the respondents in this national survey indicate that they've been denied or terminated from either TANF or SNAP. Again, indicating that unfortunately access to benefits is a challenge for Latino families. These are benefits that they deserve. And unfortunately, access to benefits is even lower among expecting Latino families, again, emphasizing that unfortunately our youngest families are facing some of the greatest challenges of any of our Latino households across the country. We asked all of the sample to indicate what their top issues that they want the federal government to address. And you see there's a wide range of important issues to Latino families across the country. Unfortunately, with the economy and the rising cost of living or inflation being the top associated with the interests or priorities of Latino families, along with improving wages and income. You see those essentially as the top 3 priorities of Latino families across the country, which again directly emphasizes the difficult challenge that our families are facing with the economy and the rising cost of living and inflation that they're having a very difficult time maneuvering around. You also see that education overall and gun violence and mass shootings, a topic that I'll turn to before I finish with you this afternoon, are also among the top 5 priorities for Latino families to address. Looking at some of the subgroups of Latino households across the country, you see that among younger parents, those under the age of 35, reducing housing prices are among the top 5 at 14%. You heard that from Melanie in terms of the challenges of being able to afford purchasing a home and having a piece of that American dream. You see that's reflective of a lot of our families, specifically those that are under the age of 35 in terms of parents or primary caregivers. In terms of expectant families, you see access to quality childcare and early learning at 16% was 3rd among their full priority list. And among our Spanish dominant households, Spanish language respondents, addressing gun violence and mass shootings was even higher at 29% than it was for the overall population. When we look at some of the survey results as pathways for solutions for Latino upward mobility, we heard from a large segment of survey respondents that providing goal-setting tools for education and job skills development would be a key resource that would help they and their families get ahead and achieve upward mobility, as well as providing career counseling or coaching specifically for parents of young children. That would be a solution that would help these Latino parents not only overcome some of the economic challenges that they're currently facing, but also to thrive economically for the longer term future of their families. We asked the overall survey respondents a wide range of different public policy issues that they may support. And you see a couple of those highlighted here. Overwhelming, almost universal support among Latino families across the country for guaranteed basic income programs, Those programs essentially allow families to have this revenue of income with flexibility to spend it how they see fit. So it provides a lot of utility and agency for families to make decisions because they know best where they need funding and how they can utilize it. You also see very, very strong support at 81% for government saving accounts for children that they can use later in life, whether it be to pay for tuition, pay for their first home, overcome any financial challenges that they may have. So you see that Latino families are very supportive of creative solutions to be able to utilize resources to better the economic well-being and overall ability to thrive for Latino households, not only now, but well into the future. Next theme I want to talk a little bit about with you is early childhood needs and priorities among Latino families. Again, we were talking specifically with Latino households that have children 5 years of age or younger, with a huge oversample of the youngest families of 3 years of age and younger. And you see, when we asked specifically about what they wanted the government to address specific to early childhood development and education, you see a wide range of priorities, from child safety to access to quality childcare. Again, emphasizing Melanie's point that affordable and quality childcare is necessary specifically for working families out there across the country. The cost of college tuition, access to quality pre-K, and access to bilingual programs were all high priorities for Latino families. And specifically among expecting families, we found that they're more inclined to find that education-related parent engagement and support and access to technology are extremely important for them, especially in the context of utilizing technology to find resources to support themselves and their young families. A couple of big data points that I want to emphasize and draw your attention to. We see that just over half, at 53%, of Latino families across the country have not received any childcare since their children's birth. So there's a greater demand out there than supply in most states for high quality childcare, right? And we also find that 55% of Latino families rely on a parent or family member for childcare. So we see that there's a lot of room for growth in terms of being able to meet Latino families with high quality childcare, because a large segment of our population isn't currently relying on that to support their children. We also asked Latino families what was their most important priority or most important factor that they consider specifically when looking for childcare. And you see among the top three were the affordability. As I've already laid out, right? Financial struggles, difficulty making your dollar stretch in this very difficult economy with the rising cost of living and inflation are all challenges for Latino families. So the cost and affordability of childcare is going to be paramount. But we also see that quality, right? Seeing that their childcare options have great reputations and have skilled caregivers are also a high priority, as well as ensuring that the hours of operation are accommodating to parent schedules. And specifically, we heard a lot about this from families that have working parents that need to find childcare that will work around their own work schedules. We also asked a number of other questions aiming at trying to identify policy solutions to try to meet what Latino families desire from childcare. And in this context, we asked, which of the following are the most important to you when considering your children's childcare options? And you see a range of 55%, the folks that really prioritize having fresh and nutritious foods that are served to their children, recognizing that for many of our families, a lot of the meals that their children receive each day come from outside of the home. So ensuring that they have fresh and nutritious foods is a high priority. You also see that over a third of respondents indicated to ensure that my child is academically prepared to enter preschool and kindergarten was a high priority, again, emphasizing the quality of early childhood care. You also see that 35% indicate that they want to ensure that their child has access to childcare with bilingual learning and bilingual play opportunities, right? So we saw across a number of different indicators in the survey that having bilingual opportunities for their children is an extremely high priority for Latino families across the country. Parents also highly value the opportunity to have direct and seamless communication with their childcare providers, specifically about learning and development. I'll just emphasize a few of the very specific things that Latino parents indicated to us that are highly valuable to them in their communication with their providers. You see that 70% of the sample indicated they want to hear more from their providers about the progress or challenges their child or children are making in their learning and development priorities. We also see that 63% indicate they want more opportunities to find ways that they can support their child's learning and development at home, being able to take the skills that their children are learning in their childcare opportunities and emphasize those things at home as a high priority. We also see that 63% of Latino parents and primary caregivers across the country want the opportunity for more communication with their provider about goal setting and their child's learning and development. So you see, essentially, Latino parents want more opportunities for direct engagement and more opportunities to specifically look at some of the tools that might be available to support what their child is learning outside of their home with their one-on-one time with their children in their home time as well. One of the big picture things that we want to think about in terms of pushing policymakers to support Latino families across the country is that 1 in 5 or 20% of Latino families with young children, age 5 years or younger, indicate that they have a child diagnosed with a learning disability. So we know that Latino parents across the country in this situation need added supports, added communication, added resources to be able to maneuver around some of the bureaucracy that they have to get by to be able to receive the resources that they need specifically for their children that do have some learning disabilities. So again, very important statistic, 1 in 5 Latino families across the country are in this situation. So it's a very high percentage of our overall population. We asked Latino parents and primary caregivers, to identify what the most critical skills are in their child's early development. And you see a wide range coming from reading comprehension being important to them, specifically with their children age 5 years of age or younger, social and emotional development, ensuring that their children are being exposed to the appropriate vocabulary and building out their learning tools for vocabulary is important to them, motor skills, communication and expression, higher level problem solving skills, cultural and historical education. I'll emphasize that towards the back end of my presentation on some specific goals that Latino families have in that area. And again, speaking more than one language is an important skill that we see a large segment of Latino families specifically wanting to see available for their children as they develop their skills and development at an early age. Emphasizing the values and experiences that Hispanic families across the country have with bilingual education. You see that on one end, a large segment of parents of children age 0 to 3 are not quite at the point of enrolling in bilingual language immersion or dual language programs, right? Only a third essentially have indicated that they've already put their young child into one of these programs. But you see the demand is extremely high for Latino families across the country, with 70% of Latino families overall indicating they would enroll their child in a bilingual program if it were available. So you can see from these two data points that Latino families want more opportunities to enroll their child in bilingual programs. So that tells us directly that we need to meet that demand with greater supply, right? Pushing policymakers, the education system, et cetera, to provide more opportunities, which obviously means more human capital, more, whether we think about them in terms of early childhood providers, whether we think about that in terms of pre-K educators that have bilingual skill sets themselves to be able to meet that demand from Latino families. You see that over 85% of parents in the sample support early childhood development programs in terms of especially increasing compensation for childhood educators. I emphasize that specific point among some of the other policy priorities that we see Latino families overwhelmingly support, because increasing compensation for childhood educators not only helps sustain the demand that our families have for early childhood in a period of time where we see, unfortunately, not enough folks filling out the ranks of our early childhood infrastructure. But we know that Latinas are more likely than any other racial and ethnic group, along with African Americans, to be employed in the early childhood sector. So increasing compensation for this particular sector of the labor market will also directly support the economic well-being of many Latino families out there whose parents, particularly the mothers, are employed as early childhood educators. You also see that there's huge support for increasing funding for infant mental health services that are both culturally and linguistically responsive to Latino families. And there's also overwhelming support for increasing funding for early Head Start to make this more available for all children under the age of 3 years of age or younger. So you see, essentially, all of the creative opportunities to increase education capacity for families with young children are overwhelmingly supported by Latino parents and primary caregivers across the country. Some of the other specific policies that you see have wide-ranging support among Latino families across the country. It's very difficult for a pollster to find near universal support for just about any public policy out there. So the fact that we see 93% support for expanding paid medical leave just tells you how important that is to Latino families across the country. You also see nearly 90% support for at least 6 months of paid maternity and paternity leave. Latinos, unfortunately, are least likely than just about any other racial and ethnic group to have access to paid maternity and paternity leave. So that's an important policy for the Latino community in particular. And you see 84% of the overall sample indicates that they support reducing gaps in Medicaid or CHIP healthcare coverage. And again, an important policy given that we saw, unfortunately, a large segment of our Latino households right now lack access to health coverage for themselves or their children. I want to transition quickly, looking at the clock, to another major theme that we saw in the survey, and that's unfortunately the high exposure to gun violence, racism, and mental health challenges as very important priorities and concerns for Latino families. First, very sobering and eye-popping data, you see that nearly 1/5 of respondents have either they themselves or their children been at school or a public place during a violent shooting incident. So that's nearly 1/5 of Latino households not seeing this on television, not hearing about it, but unfortunately they themselves being directly witness to violence in the context of a shooting incident. That's slightly higher even among expected parents who have been at a school or a public place during a violent school shooting or incident. Consequently, you see that over 60% of Latino families across the country are extremely concerned that their child could be a victim of a mass shooting over their lifetime. In fact, only 3% you see are unconcerned with their child, unfortunately, potentially being a victim of a mass shooting at some point in their life. Again, very, very sobering data that gives you a vantage point of just how difficult this challenge is for many of our families across the country. You see, as a result of the high concern that Latino parents and primary caregivers have about gun violence, you see strong support for a wide range of different public policy issues, indicating, for example, that 74% of Latino parents believe it is very important that policy makers take more aggressive steps to reduce the number of mass shootings. And you see that nearly 67% of Latino parents want laws covering the sales of guns to be more strict, and 74%, right? So nearly 3/4 of Latino parents believe that there should be mandatory universal background checks for all firearm sales. So you see Latino parents support commonsensical gun policy that hopefully will have a positive impact, unfortunately, on the wide-ranging gun violence that far too many of our households are unfortunately experiencing on a day-to-day basis. We also found, unfortunately, that far too many Latino families face discrimination every day just for being Latino. In fact, you see a large segment of Latino parents and primary caregivers across the country indicate that they themselves have experienced discrimination or been treated unfairly because they are Latino or Hispanic. That includes being called offensive names or told go back to another country, or being criticized for speaking Spanish in a public place. But unfortunately, we're seeing that this happens far too often in very public places like stores, parks, unfortunately dealing with law enforcement or other authorities, and unfortunately at their place of employment, right? So far too many of our community are not only facing discrimination, but they're facing it when they go to public places or to work, right? It's something that we should be very mindful of and really push our policymakers to do something about. One of the most sobering statistics I remember when reviewing the data was that unfortunately, discrimination and bullying is not an experience reserved only for parents. In fact, we see that unfortunately, a large segment of parents indicate, to the best of their knowledge, their child has also experienced some of the same bullying or shame as a result of speaking Spanish at school or on the playground, or experienced discrimination unfairly even at their school or their childcare facility, specifically because they're Hispanic or Latino, right? So unfortunately, this is a very bad situation that far too many parents are having to deal with. And you see that when this occurs, fortunately, a large segment of Latino parents feel comfortable and confident to be able to confront the person who discriminated against or bullied their child. And in fact, we see that a large segment of 56% of those parents and primary caregivers have used this opportunity to talk to their child about racism and discrimination, or 35% indicating that they've actually raised this issue with the school or their child care facility. So we see that Latino parents are at least meeting this challenge head on and trying to do something about it, which I think is a positive overall data point from a very negative overall experience. Parents also value talking to children about racism and discrimination. In fact, you see that 59% of Latino parents and primary caregivers find that is very important that you speak to your children at home about racism or discrimination. But unfortunately, we see that a large segment of Latino households indicate that unfortunately, they feel that their children are going to face as much, if not more, discrimination in their lifetimes than they themselves have even faced. So unfortunately, many of our community members have faced discrimination themselves and are not optimistic about the future in this country, finding that their children might actually have greater experiences with discrimination. Again, unfortunately, projecting that Latino parents are concerned about the future and the world in which their children are going to be raised in here in the United States. Children believe parents believe that their children should have the opportunity to learn about race and racism in their U.S. history curriculum in public schools. You see 77% or over 3/4 of parents believe that that should take place. So unfortunately, as many states are considering doing the opposite and removing discussions about race, racism, structural racism, etc., we see that overwhelmingly Latino parents believe this should be part of the curriculum and part of the responsibility of our school system to make sure that our children have some formal education about the realities in which the United States operates around race and racism. Finally, to close out the presentation, I want to emphasize that unfortunately, the overwhelming majority of respondents are at least slightly concerned about they themselves and their children's mental health. Parents are even more likely to be extremely concerned about their children's mental health than their own personal mental health. So you see a wide range of economic challenges, racism and bullying, all these different scenarios unfortunately create a large mental health challenge for our Latino families across the country, unfortunately at a time where access to mental health is the lowest among Latinos as it is for any other racial and ethnic group in the United States. We see that as a consequence of this, the overwhelming majority of respondents are at least slightly concerned about their children's mental health, and consequently, parents want to see opportunities for support to manage themselves stress and anxiety as well as that for their children. So you see that over 1/3 indicate more personal time, whether that's the opportunity for meditation or exercise. You see emotional support and counseling or therapy being a high priority. And at a simple level, just having more opportunities for social interaction with friends and peers, right? Being something they see as an opportunity to manage stress and anxiety that they deal with on the day-to-day level. And Latino families, as you saw earlier, overwhelmingly support more funding for infant mental health services. Again, recognizing that unfortunately, even our youngest children are facing realities that create mental health challenges, and they want to see more funding to be able to provide some services for this very specific population that unfortunately is far too young to be dealing with mental health challenges. So with that, that closes out the data presentation. I know I covered a lot of data relatively quickly, but hopefully that provides for many of you the opportunity to see that your experiences on the ground are consistent with what we're seeing from Latino families across the country.
Thank you, Gabe, for that presentation and for running through so much data right in a short period of time. We did get a lot of questions as you were speaking about having access to this data. And the wonderful part of this is that we have created an incredible interactive report that we're going to share a link with you at the end of the presentation. So we look forward to you engaging with the data. There's stories in there, including Melanie's stories and other parents and caregivers, links to additional resources. And we'll be adding additional links throughout the year as we launch this Latino Infant Initiative. So we'll be sharing that here soon. You will be the first to receive the link through this webinar. So we're excited to launch this with you all here today. With that, I want to go to Amalia Chamorro, who is the Director of Education Policy at UnidosUS, just a great partner with us in all this, to give some reactions as to national policy and advocacy implications as it relates to the data we just heard. Amalia?
Sure. Thank you, Adrian, and Gabe, too, for taking us through that gallery walk of just like really rich data. So I was able to participate too in our original webinar, which happened before the midterm elections. And so it's just a good opportunity to kind of come back to you all with a post-midterms elections perspective. I think one thing that is clear from just the November midterms elections is that the race for 2024 is already on. And that's really going to have a key role in how the political dynamics play out and how policy and advocacy efforts are impacted over the next couple of years. And I think as many of you saw last week on C-SPAN or whichever news cycle that you watch regarding the Speaker of the House vote, that really gives us a glimpse of the gridlock that is expected in the new Congress, not just between the different parties, Democrats and Republicans, and the chambers, the House and the Senate, but also within the Republican Party itself, which is now holding the majority in the House of Representatives. And the Democrats did maintain a narrow margin in the Senate. But one of the last congressional actions that Congress did take right before the holidays at the end of 2022 was passing the federal budget. And that's something that the federal government actually has to do every year. So that's something that we will continue to push for in terms of getting increases in some of the critical federal programs that help to support working families. So the so-called omnibus bill, which is the federal budget bill that passed just last month, did include some critical funding for programs, but there were also some missed opportunities, including not making permanent the 2021 child tax credit provisions, which may work to reverse the progress that has been made in reducing child poverty and eliminating some of the critical economic supports that are helping to support more than 19 million children and their families. So that's something that many of the Latino advocates will continue to push for, along with the child care sector. And so the reality is that opportunities to advance policies are going to be limited in the new Congress, but at the same time, we can't stop. So we should continue to push for federal supports for families with young children, keep Congress accountable to meet the needs of the constituents that they serve and actually govern and legislate, which is what they have been voted to do, and also to inform national policy conversation leading up to the 2024 elections. In the survey, and I think Gabe alluded to some of the federal aid programs that Latinos overwhelmingly support include expanding paid medical and family leave and reducing gaps in healthcare. And advocates can also continue to pursue other avenues besides federal government and Congress, but the federal policy can also be adopted through administrative action by the president and also through federal agencies such as the Health and Human Services Department, and also at the state and local levels. And I know Javier, after me, will share a little bit more about some of the state opportunities there. So just want to also make sure that we reiterate that both Unidos together with Abriendo Puertas do continue to have a strong commitment to make sure that we fight for Latino priorities in the next 2 critical years and beyond. And just to go over some of the key findings and themes from the presentation that Gabe just shared with you all. Of course, we know the economy is front and center and is driving a lot of the decisions that families are making. As you saw from the data, 36% of Latinos report that their financial situation has actually worsened in the past year. And so we want to make sure that we mitigate those trends. Childcare, Melanie spoke about how much of a barrier affordable childcare is for working parents, and many of them are trying to make ends meet and having to crunch the numbers and do the math as to whether it makes sense for them to continue to work and have most of their income, if not all of their income, go to childcare or stay home in lieu of childcare. So that's just, one of the many hard decisions that parents are having to calculate. And Gabe also shared about, how more than half of Latino families have never received childcare since their children's birth. And I think this really underscores that there is a huge disconnect between the need and availability of affordable quality childcare for Latino families, and something that we need to continue to make sure that we expand and provide. Another key finding is that parents do place a high value on their children's education and development from a very young age. And we know that from the civil rights perspective, right, education can be an equalizer to opportunity and upward mobility. And most parents do believe that the first year of their child's life is highly important. So learning doesn't begin when you enter kindergarten, but from the moment a child is born, about 90% of parents support government funding to expand early Head Start for their children 3 years and younger. So I think that's critical to underscore that parents do believe learning starts at a very, very young age. But economic challenges are impeding parents' ability to invest in their child's education. As about 1/3 of parents who were surveyed have had to postpone their child's activities due to economic challenges over the past year. And as we saw from the data, parents themselves are having to either pause or hold off on their own higher education programs, which they are pursuing, right, to make sure that their families have future opportunities for economic mobility. So as we saw from the survey, 1 in 10 Latino parents have either put on hold or stopped their higher education programs. And this is a concerning trend because just prior to the pandemic, Unidos had done a lot of research and we had published the Latino policy agenda for higher education. But between 1990 and 2020, Latino enrollment in post-secondary programs had actually increased by a huge 372%. But we saw the first decline in Latino enrollment during the pandemic. And Melanie spoke about, just how helpful it would be if student debt forgiveness was able to proceed, just to help her family's situation, but she's not alone in that. If student debt forgiveness was upheld by the Supreme Court, which is going to be hearing arguments next month, about 1/3 of Latino student borrowers would actually see their student debts wiped out. And that would be a huge game changer for many families, especially considering that 70% of Latinos in post-secondary education, like Melanie, are the first in their families to attend college. And many of them come from families with limited income and had to take out student loans in order to be able to afford their higher education. So Unidos, although we successfully advocated for the president to take executive action on student loan forgiveness, we continue to monitor and see how the courts rule on that policy. And we have signed on to a friend of the court or an amicus brief before the Supreme Court next month. So I know I just have just a couple minutes left, but I did want to also highlight that another theme that we heard from parents was that they overwhelmingly want to know how their children are doing in their learning environment, and that they do place a high value on the communication with their childcare providers. One point of data that the survey also uplifted was that 1 in 5 parents reported having a child with a learning disability. And I think that's particularly important because Unidos, my colleague Bob Stechek, who's our Director of Education Early Initiatives, conducted a series of focus groups with parents last year in 2022. And one of the main themes that we heard from parents, or one of the findings, was just the misinformation that they were receiving regarding their children and speech therapists and being told not to confuse their children by speaking Spanish. And that's not backed by decades of research and science and evidence. So we recently published a topic brief on this issue with some recommendations for programs, parents, and family members and policymakers to respond to that particular issue. And I'll put a link in the chat once I transition over to Javier. But I also wanted to just highlight that the survey did show that speaking more than one language was one of the most critical skills for child development that Latino parents said was important. And so I think we need to continue to make sure that we're listening to Latino parents, that we are supporting, how they want their children to develop and to learn, and that includes dual language development. And then just to hand it over to Javier, although the survey includes a lot of data, including other issues that I wasn't able to touch on, but Gabe shared a lot of really helpful information around child safety and mental health, and the discrimination that Latino parents and their children continue to face. I would just invite all of you to, take a look at the data, the report that we are releasing, and dive deeper into those areas, and really utilize the data to help inform your advocacy efforts, your program development, and also your parent engagement. And so now I have the privilege of turning it over to Javier to discuss state policy opportunities and implications. Javier?
Thank you, Amalia, very much. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Dr. Sanchez. Thank you, Melanie, for the time. I'm Javier Martínez, and I'm a national policy consultant for Abriendo Puertas, Opening Doors, and very excited to be here today to share with you some state examples that I think are critical lessons for us to take away as we move into the next 12 months of work. Let me start by focusing a little bit on the state of New Mexico, which happens to be my home state, and it's a place where over the last 10 years, a very dedicated cohort of families with young children, led by Latino families, many of them first-generation immigrants, have really spearheaded a movement toward building a quality, fully accessible, and universal early childhood system. Of course, one of the very first things we need to look at when building that kind of system is funding. New Mexico is a place where we have figured out how to fund early childhood education in a way that provides full accessibility to families from throughout the state. As many of you know, New Mexico is a large, very rural state, and therefore delivery of service can sometimes be difficult. But in New Mexico, we've been able to figure out a braided system between local nonprofits and small for-profit businesses, generally owned by women of color, and also the public sector through our public schools and Head Starts and others. This past year, New Mexico, after a 10-year battle, was able to enshrine in its constitution a permanent funding stream for early childhood education. This makes us, I believe, we're the only one in the country with that kind of constitutional commitment to early childhood. This particular funding stream is valued to start with at about $150 million per year, but it's going to grow every year because that is a percentage of a much larger sovereign wealth fund that is valued at $24 billion and growing. This will provide comprehensive early childhood services, including childcare, pre-K, home visitation, as well as a slew of other services that families may need, including behavioral and other services for children. 2 years ago in New Mexico, we also established what we call the Early Childhood Trust Fund. This is yet another permanent funding stream that will help fund comprehensive early childhood services. That fund is currently valued at $2 billion with annual distributions of about $35 million per year. As we like to say in New Mexico, at some point, every baby in New Mexico will in fact be a trust fund baby, which is super exciting as we move into the next few years of work here in New Mexico. Next slide, please. Thank you. Tax policy is also something that New Mexico has taking into account. We're looking at investing in the whole child. As is probably the case in many of your states, tax policy is often not written by families for families. It's usually written by accountants and lawyers and corporate lobbyists. In New Mexico, over the last 4 years, we have been able to push forth some very comprehensive and smart policy with regard to taxation and how we write a tax policy that benefits working families and families with children. In New Mexico, we have something called the Working Families Tax Credit, which is the state's equivalent of the federal earned income tax credit. That credit was actually started, the federal one, by Republican President Gerald Ford in the 70s. And President Ronald Reagan coined it as the best anti-poverty, best pro-family, best job creation measure to come out of Congress in the 1980s when it was expanded to its current levels. For years, New Mexico had a 10% working families tax credit, 10% of the federal credit. 2 years ago, families fought and were able to get an increase to that working families tax credit, and it is valued now at 25% of the federal earned income tax credit. The other thing to note here is that it's open to all income qualified workers, and that is inclusive of undocumented workers as well as young childless workers. This last subgroup is a group that is left out of the federal earned income tax credit, and it generally impacts children who might be in foster care who age out of that foster care system. This working families tax credit becomes one of the most generous in the country. I think New Mexico is now top 3 in terms of the value and one of the top 2 in terms of how inclusive it is. Last but not least, in New Mexico, there's also something called the child tax credit. As we heard from Amalia, it was not made permanent after the pandemic, after the ARPA bill, I believe, and it was not included in the omnibus bill. New Mexico last year created a child tax credit, which is valued at anywhere between $25 and $175 per qualifying child. There will be proposals this year to double or even triple the value of that tax credit, which would take it up to upwards of $600 per qualifying child. Now, when we look at other states, the state of New Jersey pops out in terms of how robust its early childhood funding streams have become. And if you go to the next slide, please. Thank you. New Jersey ranks first in the nation in pre-K based based on access, quality, and affordability. And over the past 5 years has invested over $300 million in pre-K. 68% of children in the state of New Jersey under 5 are enrolled in an early childhood program, and that is compared to 40% nationwide. And 1 in 3 students in pre-K are paid for by the state. The other thing that is really exciting about New Jersey is how they're investing in workforce. That's something that New Mexico has not quite figured out yet. We're getting better at it. We did create an early childhood and care department 3 years ago or so, which is helping us get our head around that. But that is a challenge that remains, I think, for probably most of our states. And I think New Jersey has a good model for how to do that. And then I'll end, if you go to the next slide, I'll end with the next frontier, I think, of investments and policies that help benefit families and the whole child, and that's paid family leave. As we heard from Dr. Sanchez, that is an area of great concern for Latino families. And I think if COVID taught us anything, it's the fact that we need paid family leave. For those workers who don't have employment opportunities that are family friendly, this could be a real challenge. So far, 13 states and DC have paid family leave laws, and they range anywhere from 6 weeks to 30 weeks. And these provide for anything from parental, medical, family caregiving, domestic violence, as well as military care. As of now, legislation has been introduced in 11 other states. New Mexico will almost certainly be following suit. But without Congress acting and having a federal paid family leave policy in place, we are still leaving tens of millions of Americans out of this critical component for families, especially low-wage workers and families who, again, may not be working for institutions, agencies, businesses that are family friendly in their policies. With that, I'll kick it over to Adrian to close us out, and thank you all very much for the time and the opportunity.
Thank you, Javier and Amalia, for those comments and relating it back to both federal and state legislative policy. We are at 3:01, so I'm going to take some time to just ask a couple questions here that you all put in the Q&A. We also went ahead and dropped in the link to the full report there that has both the data as well as the narratives, and we'll continue to keep that updated and add additional resources there. This is really meant to be a tool for you all, for partners, organizations, local entities, advocates that are working on behalf of families and children. And so we'd love for you to use it, get a hold of us. If Josefina, if you'll pull up our contact information there. If you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of a lot of us, because I see a lot of our partners on this, but we'll share our email and contact information for if you have any additional questions. We'll also be in touch with you by sharing these slides, the webinar recording in both English and Spanish by using your registration email. So a question for Dr. Gabe Sanchez, and I'll start with this one. Ryan Murphy asked, I know that you oversampled New Mexico and LA County in this national poll. Did you observe significant differences in the results based on the geography of the respondents? For example, the assumption is that Florida and Texas, Latinos are more conservative, and California and New Mexico are more progressive.
No, great question, Ryan. I appreciate you throwing in the Q&A chat because I could look up the data while waiting for the Q&A to start. Although there are some slight differences, and you're right, California and New Mexico tends to be a bit more progressive. I think the main take-home message is that there's strong consistency across not only region, but other subgroups of the Latino population, where in almost every single case, everybody across the population supports different public policy issues. New Mexico is front of my brain. I'm putting together a blog post for Brookings specific to the New Mexico data, connecting it to some of the early childhood amendment conversation that you heard from Mr. Javier Martínez. So I was looking at that data recently. In many cases, the overall support for things like guaranteed basic income or other policy interventions are the same for New Mexicans as it is for everybody else. But the sense of I guess, saliency or urgency is a bit higher in New Mexico. For example, just on guaranteed basic income as an example of a larger trend, Latinos in New Mexico are 10% more likely than everybody else to strongly support GBI programs. So although support overall is pretty consistent, which I think is an important finding across all subgroups, including region, like strongly support does tend to be a bit higher among New Mexicans as well as those in LA County.
Thank you for that, Gabe. Appreciate that response. We also have a question from Nicole. Do you have a sense of why the Latino families do not have childcare? Why Latino families do not have childcare? What is the best way to connect with Latino families? And I'll, ask also the panel to chime in here. Some of the data that we saw are families, especially as we look at children from birth to 3 years old, are actually selecting family and home-based care more so than center-based care. So some of those numbers, the high numbers that you see in families not accessing childcare centers are as a result of using home-based and family-based care. In addition to that, affordability and accessibility, as Melanie, shared with us, seems to be also an issue for Latino families. A lot of childcare programs, unfortunately, don't have flexibility in sort of the hours and the offering as far as not requiring full-time childcare. And a lot of Latino families want some flexibility. We saw that in the report as far as the high priority areas. They want flexibility within their childcare options and priorities. Would anybody else like to add to that, panelists? Great.
I'll jump in with one quick addition to your main point, Adrian, about a large segment of families essentially choosing to have children either in home-based or with family members. And I've done a lot of focus groups and surveys on this topic over the years. And one of the main reasons that we find many families opting to have family members relative to out-of-home childcare-based facilities is lack of trust. And I often remind state policymakers, state early childhood departments, that essentially when you're asking parents to allow, especially state overseeing programs, right, to oversee their children 3 years of age or younger, that requires an awful lot of trust in the state, right, to be able to put your child in care at that early of an age. And so we always have to remind ourselves, Latino parents, right, they might have good reason not to trust our state systems for a number of different structural reasons. And so we have to remember that just because you build it in some cases with the robust early childhood care system doesn't mean our parents are going to trust to utilize it until they hear others in their network have positive experiences. So I think that just adds to the notion that, you know, we have to be mindful of the fact that it requires an awful lot of trust, and the state has to earn our families' trust to be able to see higher levels of engagement.
Thank you for that. And then the best way to connect with Latino families, as Gabe, indicated, the trust factor. Work with your local trusted organizations, your childcare providers. There was a good message in there from one of the participants about childcare providers. That includes family and home-based providers being a resource for families. Social media. If you go into the report, you'll see that high numbers of Latino families are consuming social media. So accessing families also through social media is also an effective way. Churches and schools, doctors' offices also pull high as far as a trust factor in connecting with Latino families. So with that, we got a question about like specific communities and data around specific geographic areas. Feel free to reach out to us. We, it's hard to kind of look at specific, and Gabe, you can maybe talk a little bit about samples by community. We did do an oversample in LA County in New Mexico, so we'll be releasing additional data according to those oversamples. But as far as it goes to specific communities, we do not at this point really are able to provide data by specific communities and cities. Gabe, anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, I'll just add, I mean, we would love to, right? I mean, place matters, and we understand those of you that are situated in your community want to see yourself visible in the data. The challenge that we have is, if you don't get to at least 100 respondents in any particular geographical area, whether that's city, county, state, et cetera. Remember I shared with you those margin of errors early on that were like 2.7%. Under 100 people, those blow up to the point in some cases, the data is not very meaningful and could actually be misleading. So note, if you don't see that in the data that we release, it's for good reason. We don't want to mislead or create any confusion by misrepresenting your communities with data that's not represented.
Great. Well, with that, we went over 10 minutes to answer your questions. Want to again thank the panelists. Thank you, Melanie, Javier, Amalia, Gabe, Josefina, who was behind the scenes and helped, and our translator, interpreter, Edna. Thank you all for being with us here today. Thank you to the participants. We'll be in touch with you. Have a wonderful rest of the week, and thanks for all your great work and amazing work you do in your local communities. Nos vemos. Hasta luego.